Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Gaming the System, the gaming podcast where four intersectional feminists examine gaming through a feminist lens. We are Matt, Alex, and Jem today, and we're going to be talking about women in war games. So, for all of history, war has been a man's game. Um, do either of you know when women were allowed to serve in combat units in the UK military?
Not off the top of my head, no.
What
I think it's
decade?
quite recent. It's quite recent, wasn't it? I think it was like in the either late 90s or early noughties.
Women weren't allowed in combat units until 2016
Wow.
in limited roles, but now since 2018 they can be in any combat unit.
But they have been involved in war, haven't they?
Yeah.
And in many other capacities. And there are lots of famous examples of women who were masquerading as men and have done all sorts of exciting things. I think Sandy Toksvig probably has a book or two about them.
Yeah, because that's exactly the thing. Women get to support the men while the men do the heroic things, even though combat isn't something that anyone should want to be in. But if you think that the toxicity of war, so we're talking about war specifically rather than violence in general, because there are many different kinds of violence, like child abuse or sexual violence. This particular episode is about war specifically. So if you think of the toxicity of how war is viewed, so take back to World War II, for example, you were expected, if you were a real man, you should be able to go and kill people and risk death and suffer terrible things. And if you couldn't do that, then you weren't a real man. So that ingrains that, and that message is still there. And if you're a man and you're not capable of violence, then you're not an alpha male. But then when you think of women have always been told they're too emotional for things, they're too emotional to fight, they're too emotional to lead. But I can't really think of anything more emotionally unstable than needing to commit terrible violence on a mass scale for anything. So we're going to start off with the question of what relationship have we all had with war games so far? Jem, how about you?
I've had very little relationship with war games. I would describe myself as pacifist in that I don't really agree with I don't agree with violence under any circumstances, and I believe that war is state-sanctioned murder, and I have real issue with it. I do, however, live in the real world, and I do accept that there are circumstances where it is viewed to be the only option, and therefore does happen. However, I have never ever really got my head around why people would want to play a game that to get joy out of something that is, in my view, so abhorrent and so problematic in our world. I find that difficult. I mean, I do obviously play games that have common, and so you could argue the World of Warcraft, for example, is there are wars going on within those, or skirmishes at least. But I think that for me, there's a bigger that's so fantastical that it's not talking about real world stuff. So I've never played games like Call of Duty or anything that sort of recreates old. I don't even like watching the TV shows about war and things like that. So it's not something that's ever really appealed to me or interested me. And I don't think that isn't only because I don't really like the sort of first person style, which is usually the way it goes. I'm not interested in the tactics. The closest I came to anything like that was I did play Age of Empires quite a lot. And that's obviously a sort of tactical god style war game. But again, it was, for me, it was all about the technology and the building and the advancement that way, and the fighting was quite annoying, really. So I have very negative and experience of games, which I appreciate means that I don't necessarily know the positive sides of it. So I am coming at this from a very biased perspective. Just to lay it out there.
Do you think if there had been a mixing in of playable female characters, do you think that might have brought you in slightly, or you would have stayed the same?
I don't think it would have, because for me, it's like fox hunting to be I don't. I can I used to enjoy riding when I was much younger, but I never wanted to, I don't want to be involved in something that I don't get pleasure from playing something that I know does so much harm and causes so much damage. I just can't separate. I mean, I remember watching Good Morning Vietnam when I was quite young, and just being horrified, like properly horrified and distressed. Like, why would people do this to each other? And I understand that films and games and things can educate people, and that was why that film had been made, for example. But yeah, I just find it too. I don't want to be reminded about how awful people can be to each other. It just doesn't appeal to me.
It's an interesting thing you said about education, and the problem is so much of our education and what we learn is overwhelmed with propaganda influences.
Absolutely.
So, for example, this is a really prescient episode because we've been thinking about the Iraq War that the UK joined America in starting and fighting. And our Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair, has just been awarded a knighthood, even though there is serious arguments that he should be tried as a war criminal because of the horrifying impact on Iraq and Iraqi citizens and the infrastructure and politics and creating a terrorist insurgency alongside America. But he has never apologized. And I think you can be convinced by how the real world reacted to it and think, oh, maybe he really didn't know. But I recommend you find a podcast called The Dollop, and they have an episode on the Iraq War, and it's an hour and a half showing the staggering arrogance, imbecility, and cruelty and ignorance that was behind their reasoning for the war. And then if you look at Tony Blair and say, how could you possibly have looked at this and then followed it in? So that's the conversation that we're having about war in general. So when it comes to this, you think about Call of Duty, Modern Warfare. That's what set the tone for the next 17 odd years since it was released. And that was, it replaced the screaming German Nazis with screaming brown terrorists. And then that is the propaganda that people like me was brought up in. I've been playing Call of Duty since I was like 12. And fighting wars in the Middle East, that was just normal to me. And that's what so many people have been brought up with, to sort of sanitizing it. And I love war games. I love playing that kind of game. But again, we talk a lot about propaganda literacy here. You need to be able to know what you're being shown is not real, and get some realize the context. And that's when we're going to bring it back round to women in war in a moment, after talking it a bit more generally. Alex, what relationship have you had with war games?
Yes, fairly similar to Jem, in that I haven't had too much experience of games you've mentioned, like COD. I think I've only played Call of Duty once. I have played Sniper Elite, one of the Sniper Elite games, but then I had to have a think about, in terms of war as a concept, and the games that have wars within them. Or I should mention also, in terms of real-world wars that actually happened, LA Noire is an interesting game in that it deals with the aftermath of war and the Vietnam War and the impact on the characters you play in that game. In terms of wars that aren't real, quote unquote, you've got games like Shadow of War, the Lord of the Rings based game, which was a little bit more tactical, but also dealt with, obviously, J.R.R. Tolkien, kind of based a lot of it on the First World War. And then you've got games like Skyrim and The Witcher. Assassin's Creed, obviously, is really well known for it pitting the Assassin's Order against the Templars. There's always sort of two sides in these stories as well. And I suppose another one I wrote down, just as an interesting thought, was the Worms games as well, because they are technically, you could argue, they are war games as well. So those are the types of games I've played that you could argue are war games. But again, I haven't had much experience with shooter type games, the first person shooters, because I just don't like the atmosphere of them. I think I'll get onto it a bit more later, but I think they're very masculine spaces, and they're very they're designed to make you feel patriotic and that the side you're on is the good side, and it doesn't necessarily look at it from an objective point of view, looking at both sides and considering those, really. So I think that would be my answer to that question.
I completely hadn't. I hadn't even thought about the multiplayer aspect, because
no, that's a good point.
war game multiplayer stuff, that's ground zero for the toxic masculine gaming environment. And games are meant to be fun, and war games make war seem fun, which is fine, because that's what gaming does. It creates a fictional world, and gaming does not cause violence. That's not what we're saying at all.
No.
We're talking about how games sort of put certain indoctrination dogmas into your head without you even realizing. And thinking of the multiplayer aspect, it feels like you're basically trying to recreate what it would actually be like the relationships. Like if you had 10 people in foxholes in World War II, you've seen Band of Brothers and you've seen Saving Private Ryan. That's the kind of like understandable, like that's what the bravado of what was happening at the time, and there's definitely a social role in that in war. But when it comes to the war multiplayer, particularly around young kids, they're learning to behave terribly and very toxically. And we had an interesting chat with Anya on the Webstock episode that we released on our first Thursday this year, about whether you should let children play games that are above their age rating. And again, well, I'm thinking about that in a different context now after just this like 10-minute chat. Moving on to women specifically. So women are playable characters in a lot of shooters now. However, what they've essentially been doing is just making the same game, but you can play as a woman in the normal role that they would normally cast a man, which is good, which is what they should have been doing from the start. But they haven't, because they think that men don't want to play as women, and women don't play games, even though that is entirely false. It's a 50-50 split, basically. So they're still only going with the gung-ho, I'm the middle-aged white man hero saving the world from the I'm good and the enemy is evil, which is where it becomes very problematic when they use real world examples, especially examples that are actually ongoing at the time. Because there was Iraq and Afghanistan when modern warfare was made, and you're doing actual people in actual places. But Alex, when it comes to women's stories of war, of how they might, if they are shown or if they're not shown, what do those stories like? Trying to phrase it. Women's actual experience of war. Do you see it? Have you seen it in games?
In the games that I've played, I've got 3 notes here. I've got one for Shadow of War, Mordor Shadow of War, where I've written down that there are some characters in there that have prominent roles as like commanders of different factions within. I think it is. I don't think. No, there is an elf and there is a woman as well, and they do have prominent roles. And I remember one storyline where you're in. Trying to remember the name now. Gondor. There we go. And the woman leader of the factions in Gondor basically gets betrayed by her own father, who's sided with Mordor. And that theme of betrayal, I think, is interesting because I picked it up within LA Noire, which I know deals with the aftermath of war, but the impact of that and Cole, the main character's behaviour in having an affair with somebody else, with another woman, means that Cole's wife ends up being betrayed, potentially as a result of the impact of war. And then the other note I had, which is slightly separate, is if we think about Horizon Zero Dawn as taking place within a landscape of war between all the different tribes, you're coming in as Aloy, as an outsider to that, and trying to decide what side you're on potentially. You could be on no side, you could just stay an outsider, or you could choose to side with a particular tribe. Same sort of thing as Skyrim, really. But those are really my experiences of women, war's impact on women, which isn't direct in a lot of ways, not in terms of combat. But those are the thoughts I had anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting because those I think the difference is when you often play as a male character or the hero, you have tremendous amounts of agency. You get to make decisions that impact your life, whereas women's experience of war has almost always been they have no agency.
Yeah.
Men start wars, men fight wars, and women have to, as with everything in society, when childcare isn't funded, when care work isn't funded. I think recently in an article they literally said families need to step up and take care, which means more free work for women. And when it comes to war specifically, there are so many fascinating stories to be told. Like, I can't believe there aren't a million games about the women in Nazi Germany, not in Nazi Germany, in Nazi occupied France, because they were
The
fucking
resistance, there's a lot to go on.
badass,
Yeah.
unbelievable badasses fighting. And if you think about this is never talked about. War is so sanitized. Just imagine for a second the number of rapes in history in war, and think, how is that not the only thing that anyone ever talks about? They should say, "Oh, we need to invade Iraq because of this." And you think, what about all the women that are going to be raped because of this? Someone never asked that question, because if they did, the Prime Minister would have to say, "But we don't care. We don't care." Okay. And just that is only, it's never even been like insinuated, because then that would then you think, oh, it's men fighting men and women suffer as a result of it. The only time I've ever seen this shown as a game was in the Call of Duty World War II, released on PS4 a few years ago. And there's one mission where you're a French resistant fighter going in to kill a Nazi bastard who killed your son, because it always has, even when you put women in games, they have to have a family relationship. That's what drives them. They can't just be heroes because they're heroes. So that was good, and you want more of that, because there's nothing more that really touches something primal in you when you think of violence is so gendered, and war paints everything so black and white. So Jem, what do you think about how women and their war has an impact on them is like in games?
I think that if you're just looking at sort of the equivalent roles for women, now that women are able to be actively involved in wars, then I think their experience probably is slightly different. Well, probably dramatically different, but from a gaming perspective, I don't think that it necessarily needs to be sort of that aspect of, you know, like having to go through all those the extra level of work that women have to do to get into the equivalent roles as their male counterparts and things like that wouldn't be very much fun, I think, to play from a gaming perspective. So I'm not sort of critical of the fact they don't include that, and I think it is good that we can now play female characters in these roles, and I think that, you know, it's also important that they are playing the same roles, because they're doing the same roles out in the real world, and that should be represented in the game. So I think that's a positive thing. I think that you would never see the genuine representation of women's experience in war, because it's horrific, you know, as you've said. I mean, you know, and we need to put trigger warning on this show, but, you know, rape as a is and has always been used as a weapon in war. And although women are not the only victims of that experience, it is primarily women who experience that. And also, if you are a mother and all your men have gone off to war, you know, and you're left with your children, then you have an additional layer of the whole thing about having to protect and care for them in this horrendous scenario. So it's not just protecting yourself and worrying about whether you can stay safe, whether you can stay fed, whether you can find shelter. It's also about, you know, worrying about the children, young children that you may have, or the elderly relatives that you may also be caring for, you know, because, you know, war is something that it impacts every single person, but we always focus on the able-bodied, you know, young, healthy, fit generations, and we don't think about all the other people that are left and abandoned and struggling to kind of get through it. And blatantly, no one's going to want to play that game. That would be a really shit game, and you know, that's because it's just a really horrible experience. And, you know, I have never experienced it, you know, so I'm talking from, you know, how I imagine it to be and from what I read and understand. But, you know, I we're never going to properly represent the experiences of women in war, and I think by the same merits we're not going to properly represent the experiences of men in war. Actually, I think, as you said earlier, Matt, you know, this is it's all just a big propaganda machine, really. It's because at the end of the day, the powers that be need to have a bunch of citizens who are prepared to go and fight their battles for them, you know, and war games and things help to promote this idea of, as Alex, you said, you know, that we're right and they're wrong, and it's very clear. There is no, you know, there are no shades of grey. So I think it's a difficult one, because if we adequately represented women in war, then I think it would be horrible. But I do think your point about, you know, that there are other ways that women engage with war that could be represented, and the proper stories could be told without being salacious in the background to the fight, you know, the fun bit, the fun bit of running around and shooting people. I can't get behind it. But there are ways that we can demand that a greater story is told. And I think I was just reading one about 8 Days in Fallujah. I don't know how it came about, but I've heard, I was reading about how really the primary motivation there was about showing people what it was really like and trying to give a genuine representation of it. But I think the problem is that when you're doing something for entertainment, there's always a limit to how genuine that can be. So,
well, this discussion has made me think of this might be a topic for a separate podcast. The musical Miss Saigon. Has anyone seen that? That
hate
kind
musicals.
of portrays. It's set in the
Sorry.
Vietnam War, and you don't like musicals, Matt. You should
Despise them. Andrew Lloyd Webber needs to be drawn and quartered.
Fair enough. But there we are. Anyway, the point I'm making is that musical does attempt to portray a women's story within war. It's controversial because obviously all of the women in that musical are portrayed as prostitutes and sex workers, which in itself is controversial and probably wrong. And it's not an easy watch. It's quite harrowing. It's not what I would call a fun musical. And imagining that in the context of a game just isn't going to work. But it does try hard to represent what it's like to go through being a woman in war in that particular part of the world at that time, and how the character deals with rape and abandonment and all that sort of stuff. So it's not an easy watch.
I think, Matt, when you were talking about in our reasons to be hopeful, you said about story-led games and how they're very much here to stay, and I think that gives me hope for these kind of games, because, like you say, Alex, that Miss Saigon is telling this story, and if you have more faith in your gamers, in your audience, then you can tell the story well, and that way you can get the kind of duality really of war across.
Does Miss? Do you know who wrote Miss Saigon?
It was Cameron McIntosh and Tim Rice, I think.
Are they both men?
But Cameron McIntosh and Andrew Lloyd Webber are like pretty much on the same level in terms of the content that they produce.
Is Cameron a man or a woman?
Man.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I might have to take a look at it then.
At first I was quite shocked because obviously I wasn't aware of just how much sort of the way that women are sexualized in it is very overt, and that's quite difficult to stomach at first. I mean, it's a very powerful, like some of the parts of the musical are very powerful. The topics it deals with are very powerful, but they're also very difficult topics. So it's. Yeah.
Does it feel like it's got a sincere message? Because I find that again, we can probably talk about how women's experiences are exploited, but not sincerely. Do you find does Miss Saigon feel like a sincere message?
I don't think it's telling one particular story from one point of view, but it doesn't represent all women in Vietnam at that time. But I think if you were to take it at face value, it would be misleading, and that's not good. Also, I mean, this is entirely going off the rails because I've just derailed this podcast to talk about Miss Saigon now. But at the time, it was also very controversial for the fact that the male roles where they were playing Vietnamese or Asian characters were all played by non-Asian people, white people, and that was very controversial at the time. It came out in 1990, I think.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's super close to the war itself.
But
yeah. I feel like another problem that particularly Western countries like the UK and America both have we've both got a superiority complex, which is very, very unhealthy because it means that the government can say we're the best no matter what while they chip away at things that actually make us great. The problem with war is that no war since World War II has affected life itself in the UK. We've never had to do rationing. We haven't had to turn our lights out for fear of being bombed. All of our experiences of war come from very sanitized news, games, TV shows, movies. That's our experience of war. So why would we?
Yeah.
So we don't view it with the same weight as someone whose entire country has been destroyed because leaders decided to do it. So games are entertainment. That's they're meant to be entertaining, fun, enjoyable, and there's a level of trust, I think, that people put in their games not to teach them bad things, and I think that isn't something. It would require an entire new kind of conversation for society to have as a whole about propaganda. I think if you take a woman's story, and this is the problem when men are trying to make women's stories, they only think about how their life impacts the men around them. And if a woman suffers, it's usually a story points to make a man do something. Jem, you talked about this at the start about, so I'll start with Alex. Are there particular aspects of war games and women that unsettle you?
Well, in terms of war games unsettling me, I had to think about it, and I've mentioned this before on the pod. I don't feel like the modern war games, like COD and Battlefield and all that, are really targeted at me as a person. That's fine. It just means I tend to avoid them. I feel like they are very masculine. I can't connect with the character that I'm playing because I don't feel like it. It's not designed to have a deep character background. It's just designed to be, you are a soldier. This is who you are. This means you have to go and shoot people. And the multiplayer aspect of it tends to make me feel very intimidated, as I mentioned previously on the pod. It just feels very unfriendly and toxic in terms of the community around those games, and I'll touch on that again later. I've got some points to make on that. But generally, I do enjoy those games. I don't think they're fun to play. We've already talked today about how would a woman's experience of war, the real experience that a woman faces with war, be fun to play. I don't find the experience of combat in war fun to play. So I tend to avoid it.
Yeah, we say often that anything can be. Well, I said this with esports. Anything can be made entertaining.
Yeah.
Anything can be turned into a game, but and have it be excellent. But all it requires is the willpower. And there would be an audience for any form of that, but only if it was done sincerely and not in an exploitative way. So that's what I'd like to see at some point. Jem, did you have anything else to add on what unsettles you about war games?
Well, I think Alex touched on the point about the sort of masculine nature of many of the female characters in these things. I mean, you often get the army chick, and we see it in the movies as well. It's usually a woman who has a more athletic body than many women that we see out there in movies, but they're by no means muscular, and very rarely. And in fact, and I can't remember any of the names because I'm useless with names, but there's like literally 2 or 3 female actresses that actually get to take on some of these roles because there are so few roles out there for people that look like them. So that sort of, I think that says quite a lot about it. But I mean, I was, as I said, I was reading up on this, and I've come across a picture of 5 women in the army, and they do not all look like male male bodies with female faces on, which is what they so often do. Look, you've got one with long hair in a plait, you've got somebody with short hair, you've got somebody with, it's there are practicalities that women have to take with them into war, and hair is actually quite a big issue. But I think I object to the fact that when women are shown in these roles, they are a very specific type of woman, which is not representative of the actual women that are out there being in the army, which is as varied and different as the men who are in the army, and in society. So I think that's a problem. I think the other issue is that, as we were talking about with Miss Saigon, then the other side of it is that they're the sort of prostitutes and the damsels in distress, or they're the sort of femme fatales, the people that are there to trick and backstab. That it's all very tropey, and I think it becomes more tropey in this very male dominated environment. And I think it's male dominated because it's men that play it primarily, or it certainly has been. I don't know what the figures are at the moment, but it's generally men that play it, it's generally men that make them. And so it, and I think that was something that you said earlier, Matt, actually made me think about the fact that when people are writing and creating, it comes from them, so it brings them into the scenario. So a lot of people say that science fiction is telling you more about what's happening when it was written than it is about the future, because it's responding to that. And we know, we've already mentioned that Tolkien based a lot of his experiences on his story on his experiences in the war, and his feelings about the war. And so I think that when men are writing these stories about women, they are writing them as support structures for them and in relation to them. So if only men are writing, or if only white people are writing, or whatever, it always becomes about the other characters, always become in relation to their position. And you've got to be a very, very good writer, and have done a huge amount of work on unconscious bias and all of that, in order to not do that, and to not make those mistakes, which is another reason why we need more diversity in at all areas of these games, really.
That was awesome. Another one of your mic drop, moments. When it comes to like things that unsettle me with war games now, is I was thinking recently about, again, the sanitization of war. We never see pictures of bodies. We just see crumbling streets and our soldiers looking heroic. If the press were really what the press are, they should show the bodies. They should show all of those aspects, because then that would actually turn people against war, which is what the government doesn't want. It says you need to be patriotic, you need to support our troops. It's at the core of it, it's the toxic masculinity that props the patriarchy up. It's part of the support system that it keeps the cycle of potential violence going, because young boys like myself playing Call of Duty in our formative years, it just embeds that thinking, to be a real man, you need to be capable of terrible violence, and that a war and that a world with violence in it is normal. And That's a horrible thing to think. And then it normalizes your viewpoint. I've only just thought this. It normalizes your viewpoint of war in the past, thinking, oh, it can't have been that bad because it's good guys fighting bad guys, and it's as simple as that. When in fact, in World War II, in America, black soldiers weren't allowed in combat units because they thought they were lazy cowards when they were fighting the Nazis.
Yeah.
And that's another side that isn't shown, the racism side, all the horrible, fascinating. So that's fascinating. You think, you hear that one fact, think about all that entails. That's a fascinating story. Go down that road. But then if you try and go down that road, you think, oh, we're all white men. It might be a bit odd if we wrote a story about black people's lives. So we just won't do it. And then that thought pattern goes all the way to the top. I want to talk, continue the conversation in terms of toxic masculinity. Alex, what do you think about war games' relationship to toxic masculinity?
I think it's quite interesting because I very recently in fact, watched a video about how gamers are too toxic, and a shout out to Inside Games, who did a brilliant video talking about the latest reaction to Battlefield on things like subreddits and things, and how the community around those types of games is incredibly toxic, and has led to things like low sodium subreddits being created, as in not, I'm guessing, non-salty subreddits. I think that's where the pun comes in, which are making an effort to be more positive, because the toxic negativity has got so bad that people are tossing around insults for the game's developers and even the moderators within those subreddits, and making life very, very difficult for them. So I think there's something to say about the culture around those particular types of games, and how they actually made a really good point, Bruce and Lawrence, about how since Gamergate, there's been a massive increase in that type of toxicity on social media, and how, what do they call it? They did make a very good point about how those types of people have become a lot more manipulative in getting people to feel negative and to argue with each other and insult each other. They may not have necessarily even played the game, but they're just doing it to incite this really negative, toxic culture. And in a way, if you think about it, it's if you think about war being physical violence and violence against others, in a way, this has become a war of words, a verbal war between everyone some people in the community, and some people, I suppose, infiltrating the community in an attempt to just cause trouble, which isn't a great thing, really. So it's kind of a sort of sub branch of your question, but I really think it is having an impact on how people perceive those games and the communities around them, and it is certainly turning me off of those games because of those communities.
You reminded me that nothing invokes relentless, aggressive anger in toxic male communities than women standing up for themselves. That's what Gamergate was. It was women going, look at how you're all behaving. This is unacceptable. And then they turned around, attacked. No, that's what happens every time. And because women everywhere are under siege constantly, the threat of violence against women is ever present, no matter where. Another young woman was murdered I think it was in London a few days ago. Then say, well, you have to violence. They're trying to treat violence against women like they're trying to treat the pandemic now, saying, oh, you just need to learn to live with it, which means we're not going to do anything to help you, we're not doing anything to change. And war game, I think I'd like to do an episode on religion at some point. It feels like people learn the wrong lessons from games like war games. They supposed to be like working together against a common enemy. But I think these very, very simplistic black and white games might make you feel like you're always the hero and whoever you're fighting is the enemy. When you're arguing with people, thinking there are no I can't get inside the headspace of people in that, but that I've come to realize that you don't necessarily need to understand. You just need to accept that they do exist and then move on from there, because we can't. Well, most people can't deny that those can't just sit back and go, well, that doesn't impact me. And most often it's people like me, cisgender, straight, white men, who can, any situation, I could sit back and go, that doesn't impact me, I won't worry about it. But when it comes to violence against women, neither of you can just go, oh, I just won't worry about that, because then that is that's endangering yourself. And when it comes to war games, again, another one. Thinking about something that unsettles me. I don't think I mentioned this. I love the Total War games. Again, like it's always about empire. Empires are good. Always told that the British Empire was good, even though you think about the horrors that entails, and whitewashing our history when we should be learning from it, because it is fascinating as well. You're allowed to go, oh, that's terrible, but it is interesting. I played. There's one called. I can't remember what it was. Whatever it was the British. It was the colonial period when Western Europe basically took over the world, and so that was the start of the genocide of the Native Americans. Us basically taking every resource from India and South America, and then leaving them in turmoil. And I had to stop playing it because I just felt we're doing this is horrifying, monstrous things. That's what war is. And that really brought that home with me, thinking, right, you need to go and get a foothold in America, go and destroy these tribes. And then that's when you can know the truth of something and then enjoy a story about it, because that happens constantly. So that's something that I always found I had to stop that. I couldn't divorce that part of me, and I think that's what war games teach us to do a lot. It divorces us from the realities of war and violence. I made another note of uptick. Religion is often shown very black and white as well. It's either a cult or it's wonderful and lovely and real, rather than the complex thing that it is. We touched a little bit of this. What women's stories would you like to see brought to life in games, Jem?
Well, I think I've kind of I've covered that for me. I think I would like to just see more story brought to life, more my earthing's falling out. More of people's actual real experiences brought in. So more behind the scenes stuff about what's going on beyond the fighting, and I think we can do that because I think story-led gaming is becoming ever more popular, and I think that games companies are realizing that that there is money to be made from them, and that people do want that sort of immersive story told experience, but you're never going to get that in Call of Duty. I mean, I know they do have background stories, but essentially it's still fighting, and so I think I think it'd be very hard in some of the genres to ever get that in, because it just isn't what people are going there for. I mean, it would be nice if perhaps sometimes there's a conversation these days more and more about offsetting, and I know we do it with with environmental stuff, but I think it can be done with social stuff. So I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts, which is Reasons to Be Cheerful, with Ed Miliband and Jeff Lloyd, and they talked. Goes back to last year. They were talking about diversity in businesses, and they were saying that sometimes it is difficult to find diverse people to come and work in a company because of where you're based, or because of who's available and stuff. But they were saying there's no excuse for those companies not to find some way to still support the concept, and that can be by maybe supporting training further down, so that eventually people can come up and join down the line, or supporting charities that work with disadvantaged groups, or to basically put the money that they would have put into hiring more people of color, or from with disabilities, or whatever, and put that money into other areas, so that eventually they can solve that problem. And I think we could have the same with the games industry. I mean, if you want, if the games companies that are making games like Call of Duty, could also be doing some kind of work to ensure that people recognize the travesty of war, and the reasons why we need to work against it, the reasons why we need to stop with the toxic masculinity online, all of those things, then at least there would be some offsetting. So even if they couldn't actually bring it into the game, then you could feel like, well, I'm playing this game, but I am also contributing towards ensuring that these things don't happen, that that we're minimizing the amount. Because I think the biggest problem that I have with these games is that they are normalizing the idea that men are violent, and that war is inevitable. And I think, when I come into these conversations with people, which I have been doing for a long time because I'm quite passionate about this issue, I always have to put in a caveat, like, I understand that in some circumstances this has to happen, because the argument that was always chucked back at me is like, well, you can't stop a war. What are you going to do? How are you going to stop this person if this person's abusing their population? What are you going to do about it? You can't. Sometimes it's the only solution. And I do think that yeah, that is the case as it stands, but I don't think it's inevitable. I don't think it has to be like that. And I do think actually we could work towards a world. I genuinely believe that we could work towards a world where we don't have to kill each other because we want something from the other person. I genuinely think that, the people that I've met in my life, haven't felt the need to do that and navigate their daily lives without killing each other generally, and I do believe that we could do that on an international scale. I think so. That's the problem that I have, that these games are normalizing this idea that war is inevitable. And I think if they're, and I understand that it's fun, but I would like to see them being more story led, and I would like to see them contributing to better education.
You're
Rest my case.
you again, on the normalizing and the propaganda front, they do make war sound inevitable. So I think bad people will do bad things, and then you've got no choice but to go and stop them. You think of all the war and instability in the Middle East, and you think, oh, it's because of evil Middle Eastern leaders wanting war and destruction. The truth is, the last 2 decades, America, and with our help, has been destabilizing the Middle East on purpose for the benefit of weapons manufacturers and military contractors. That's why America has $750 billion dollars spent on their military, none of it goes to the actual troops, and they don't need any of it. They just give it all to the military contractors, who then turn around and donate money to the politicians, who then keep that circle going. So the problem is not violent people inevitably starting wars. It's America basically keeping that engine going just to make money. So the world we can have that Star Trek world where there is peace, but I don't know how we get there yet. I hope we will, but I do believe that the Star Trek future is possible. I can't remember what my question was. What story? Alex, what women's war stories would you like to see?
I was going to answer exactly the same as Jem. It's in my notes here. I'd like to see more of the stories behind the scenes, the problem solvers, the people that worked on the tactics, the solutions behind some of the problems faced in war. I think there's a lot of scope for really good educational games that could be made in the form of like a narrative-led game. So yeah, it's pretty much exactly the same as Jem. That is all I could think of.
Yeah, that was very exhaustive of you, Jem.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, I'd like to see some more like imagine an Assassin's Creed set in Nazi occupied France and female assassin going and
They
showing.
almost did that with the sort of miniature missions in Syndicate slightly, except that was in London in World War II. But that was they almost got there. But yeah,
yes, they sort of that's so frustrating about games now. They tentatively go, oh, there's a bit of woman stuff you can do.
Even a game about like espionage or spies would be really cool.
Yeah.
I just thought of that actually. Something like that.
I just had an idea while we were talking about a game set in a bomb making factory in World War II with women making bombs. I would play a game like that. I don't even know any. It'd be like one of those those cooking games, like Overcooked.
Yeah.
Overcooked with bombs.
But with bombs.
That would just normalize it. Just go, oh yeah, that's what women did, and then. So it doesn't all have to be dark and gloomy. You have fun. It led to a lot of freedoms for women.
It's true.
Imagine how safe women would have felt from male violence when there are no men around. And all those stories. Think of that. That's 2 ideas in an hour just from talking about it. So the 3 of us, they should hire us to make their games for them. So I'm off on a roll thinking about that now. We've just come up to the hour, so we'll that was quite a heavy topic, but I'm really proud of that. So we're going to end off with a little bit of a palate cleanser. We'll take it away from war specifically, but I've been thinking this ever since Tony Blair got his honours, been awarded a knighthood. We don't know whether he's going to get it yet. It's coming, and so there are a couple of very, very powerful men in a bit of hot water at the minute. Novak Djokovic is being kicked out of Australia for being an unvaccinated, arrogant knobhead. And hopefully, once he's out of the country, that'll be one powerful man that hasn't got what he wanted. Because clearly, his statement has been, "I'm very disappointed. I wish the rest of the players luck," which definitely his PR person wrote for him. So it's just very, very, very satisfying. But now Tony Blair and his knighthood. If any of you were awarded an honour, would you accept it? Alex?
That's a very tough question. It would depend what for and in what circumstance, I think. It's very difficult. I mean, generally, I feel like I'm reasonably... I don't want to sound too, weird about it, but I like to hope that I'm fairly humble. But I also enjoy getting recognition sometimes. Yeah, so it would very much depend what for and if I felt like I deserved it or was worthy of it. Not to sound too big-headed, but that is a good question. Yeah.
Would it depend what the honour was as well?
Yeah, there was, I mean, I don't know where to start with that one, but I don't know. I think it would in some ways. Yeah. If it was for something I felt like other people should be honoured more, I would make at that point. But yeah, that is, I think, the stance I would take.
It depends.
Yeah,
That's your answer.
yeah.
See, I actually thought of this question before the honours came up because I read an awesome essay by George Orwell, and I just thought and his criticism of empire, and thinking how monarchy is like patriarchy. That's like the top rung of what you can be, and thinking of like, oh, am I being a pawn of the empire? Am I taking part in the oppression of others and the legacy of that? So I thought, oh, maybe I'd be really go, no, I'm going to take a principled stand and go, no, I'm not going to do this. But then I thought it still would feel really cool to have that's a base like simple. It would feel cool. But then it made me think, as well as that, it will open doors for you, and the more doors are open to you, the more good you can do. Because if you've got a knighthood, then and you go and say, right, I want to talk about women violence against women, more people are going to have you on if you're Sir so and so or Lady so and so.
If you can use it as a platform to highlight other people that need to be highlighted and need to be advocated for, then that's how you would use it, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So mine is a yes, not just because it would be really cool, but also it can be both those things at the same time. Jem, how about you?
Yeah, no, I think I'm in the same camp as you, Matt. And I mean, I do have issues with the monarchy, and but I also think that that's from this basis of the lie that we're all told, which is that we also live in a democracy, which we don't. And we are not in a democratic situation. Our voting system is fundamentally flawed and therefore favours certain groups of people. The system is such that if you don't have money, you can't get involved in it. So for us to say that, to complain about the monarchy because it's a hereditary power with huge amounts of money, it acts as though we have an alternative in place, which we don't. And we've never experienced that alternative. And I'm pretty sure that there's not anywhere in the world which truly has. We're just told that we have. So for me, I think, the monarchy is flawed. It has problems, and it's ridiculous to have such a distinction. But that is the system that we have at the moment. And if I was honoured, it would be for my work, to trying to make the world a more equal and fair place, because that's what I spend all my time doing. Or it would just be for being really good at playing Animal Crossing. I don't know. But I'm guessing it would be the former. In which case, yeah, absolutely. You go, you get these things, it gives you a platform, and then you can use that platform to support others. However, there is a little voice in the back of my head that's going, oh, the ends justifies the means. The end, does it though? Does it really? So I think it would definitely perhaps with my fingers crossed behind my back or something. it would be cautiously if I did accept it. But yeah, no, I think it would be because I could do more good.
You just reminded me that the patriarchy has infinite resources. They've got all the resources of all the kinds, and so as intersectional feminists, we have to relentlessly use every single resource that we have access to, and a form of royal honor is a potent resource. So it would make sense for us to go, yes, the ends do justify the means. It's also really cool, which is even better. So I think that's it. That's a yes from the three of us, Your Majesty. If you're watching, which we know
We'll
you
be
are,
waiting.
we'll await your call. And I'll be interested to see what Caroline will ask her that
Yeah.
as well. It'll be interesting. Wow, what an awesome episode. We are back with a bang now for our second year. And you'll be able to find us every Thursday at 7 p.m. with either a live stream gaming or a full episode. And on every other Tuesday, we will have a bonus round or a deep dive. Other than that, please start off the new year by liking, sharing, and subscribing to us. The most important thing you can do is give us a comment on iTunes. That gets us up at the rankings the best, and we want as many eyes and ears on us as possible. With all that said, we are gaming the system, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.